Okay, excellent. Let's do this. So, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Darren McGarvey, author of The Social Distance Between Us: How Remote Politics Wrecked Britain, and my absolute favorite book of the last year. Darren, welcome to the show. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you. As I mentioned before we started, and I hope you don't blush a little bit too much because I'm gonna suck your metaphorical literary dick here for just a second. But it's a diagnosis of what it's like to live in modern Britain that I don't think that anyone else has been able to articulate in the way that you have. Right from the beginning, when you start talking about sort of different experiences that people have in whatever aspect it might be of life, whether it's healthcare, education, access to help in any way, shape or form, all the way down to the way that the pandemic affected all of us and it impacted people's lives in different ways. I think that the way that you've gone about explaining is so... It gives me this fantastic sense that someone actually gets what's going on in the world. Yeah, and you talk in the book about some of the stuff, and I hadn't planned to talk about this early but sure, since we're here. One of the things that you talk about in your book is some of the times you've done like work with young men, especially like trying to help them express themselves better or like learn to articulate how they're feeling better, whether that's just vocal, with words or written down or in any sense. Like, and I think it's why do you think that's such a crucial skill to teach young men? And then maybe what would be like your best piece of advice to like someone who's trying to learn how to better articulate themselves and articulate anger about injustices that they're seeing within the world?
I did an exercise with some young men where I just read out a list of random words. And I asked them to raise their hand if there was any words that I said that they wouldn't be prepared to say. And some of the words were violent sounding words. Some of the words were kind of slang terms. And then other words were like words like beautiful, words like love. And it was really interesting to see how uncomfortable they were. And the point of doing that was to illustrate to them that while they've adopted an entire way of being and sounding that's about appealing to the people around them, one day very soon, very few of those people are going to be in their life, and they're going to be stuck. They're going to be stuck with a way of seeing the world, a way of describing the world and describing themselves that's going to act as a kind of repellent of opportunity. So you've got to get the balance between being who you are and being true to who you are, but also being open-minded to new experiences, to changing, to adapting. And unfortunately for many young men, one of the reasons that they resort to aggression so quickly is just out of a sheer frustration about being unable to articulate themselves. They get lost for words and they get befuddled in conversations where they're being challenged about things, particularly if it's a middle-class person challenging them in that standard passive-aggressive way, a teacher, a police officer. And this means that they then suffer an additional disadvantage, which additionally predisposes them to interactions with the law, disciplinary action in the education system, and then they get labelled, and then this compounds the further risk they'll be drawn into the criminal justice system or further excluded. So language is really, really a lot more important within the mix of all of this than many people think. Although people like James Kelman, they know that. But when an English judging panel snob reads Kelman and complains about him being an illiterate savage, all they're betraying is their deep, deep-rooted class prejudice. They don't see all of the insight encoded within all of the coarse language, because they just wouldn't expect a man of Kelman's social class, or a woman for that matter, to be capable of the sophistication that a middle-class person seemingly possesses inherently.
Do you think that this ravine between the social classes and their experiences of modern Britain is something that has always existed? And do you think it's being made worse in the modern day in a sense, and possibly even by COVID and the lockdowns? So that sort of isolated everyone further from the experiences of everyone else. Do you think it's always been there?
Yes, I mean it's class inequalities are baked into Britain's economic structure for 1,000 years in one form or another. I mean the whole society sorting themselves into classes was really formalised by the Romans, and many of the concepts that they came up with and the principles and the mechanisms they came up with when creating their civilization were in a way about dealing with some of the fallout that comes with social class and inequality. There were different names for different social classes. People of higher social classes were subject to far more lenient punishment for crimes than lower classes, and then obviously there was the whole slavery aspect of that particular culture as well. And so when you can see how that you can see then when they withdraw, they go back. Britain moves into the next phase of its development, where it's kind of more feudal in nature. That again is just another form of class exploitation. And then we move slowly but surely towards. Sorry, my children are causing absolute mayhem here. Hang on.
That's all right.
Guys, I'm trying to work up here. Listen, can you come down? I'm trying to work up here, Lily. Go downstairs, please. It's not very clear that I'm looking up for 1 hour. Just need to go to stuff for 1 hour. Go. Lily, I'm speaking to you. Go. Down now. Lily, move. Go, Lily. Go. You're going to start crying even though Mum put the paddling pool out for you? You're not funny, pal. Just go downstairs. No. Do not go back. That's okay. Yeah. Da-da-da-da. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Don't worry.
You just edit that. Sorry, this is my life.
That's okay. Don't worry.
Right, okay, we'll just jump quickly back in. Yeah. Britain's always been like that in one form or another in terms of being unequal. Now, I don't think anyone would expect a society to be completely equal in terms of outcomes for everyone. There are lots of different factors that can also play a role in how well or less well people do, and individual merit is important to a certain extent. But one of the problems with Britain is that it's run by people who see the world from a particular vantage point, and viewing the world from that vantage point also, I would argue, means that you can kind of assume they have certain interests in life. And unfortunately, there's a sort of relationship between the privileges that some people have and the disadvantages that other people have. And I know there are people out there who just don't agree with that analysis, and they think that, meritocracy is real. But, meritocracy is only real when everyone's competing in the same weight class. When you just have middle class people and their kids competing with middle class people and their kids, then the rest of society don't get a chance to demonstrate their merit in those fields. And so that's where I think the argument about meritocracy really starts to come apart.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that you do fantastically in the book is to acknowledge these sorts of issues, and like bring the sort of like righteous anger in a sense to bear on the page, but there's no point there's no point in which, and I smiled every single time you were making a heavy point like this, and then you had the wherewithal to not be totally tribal and partisan about it, because like it's, and this seems like that should just be what a writer does, but it's such a rare thing in modern political or social commentary to see someone like assess and accept the nuance of a situation and still go on to make a really good case about why they think, you know, one side or the other may have like a better point, or, you know, it might be more right in a sense, and because there's obviously barriers, like horrible barriers for a lot of people, like a large portion of the population, probably far larger than most people would be willing to admit or be wanting to see, because we want to believe that us or our children or our grandchildren or our brothers and sisters, our family, friends, that they're all competing in a world whereby the best man or woman will win, where the people who work hard and deserve success will get it. And that's unfortunately not the reality. And yeah, you do a fantastic job of
well, it's important. It's important. I feel that when you're in the isolation that's required in order to complete a book, you really get to understand who you really are, what your emotional temperament really is, and what you really think. You know, because there are various roles that you could slip into when you're in different sorts of contexts. So if I was speaking at some kind of rally or whatever, there's a crowd psychology that's going to kick in there, where I'm naturally going to emphasize points in a particular way and tone that's appealing to people in that context. Just as, you know, if I was at home with my kids or my wife and we were discussing something, I would switch into another gear where I'm father and husband mode. And the thing about going into a book and being in isolation is that while now and again thoughts of the reader, which is very abstract, obviously, do creep in, at the same time, the process is so long and arduous that eventually all you're left with as a writer is what you actually believe. And this is further informed as you continue with research, as you take in other points of view. And because you're in the process of writing a book, you're in a place where you're very open to what's going on out there in the world. You're kind of scanning everything subconsciously because you want the book to be as current as it can possibly be. And so you're always looking for opportunities to update it with something more recent. And so for me, what that leaves me with is less vitriol, you know, less being snide for the sake of it, because I'm not writing a book that's just for the people who agree with me. I genuinely believe and know that there are people out there looking to be persuaded of things, and they're not just looking for evidence-based arguments. They're looking for people who carry themselves in a particular way, who have an even-handedness, who are emotionally temperate and passionate. Obviously, people also having conviction is an attractive quality as well. And so really, you know, when it's all said and done, after the editorial process begins, then as well as obviously correcting maybe inaccuracies in the book or trimming the book, editing it in conventional ways, you're also looking for places, or I am looking for places where, is there a gentler way of saying that? Is there a less vitriolic way of making that point? And I think that gives the book a kind of balance in terms of tone, because it means when I do talk about things that I'm not prepared to compromise tonally on, like Grenfell or Jeremy Kyle, then that really hits hard. The reader can feel that is a less restrained version of me, and then they might take that anger more seriously because it's modulated and it's not just constant outrage all the time. And then there's just the fact I'm an addict in recovery. I can't afford to be running around foaming at the mouth all the time. You know, these emotions that are the indulgence of 90% of Twitter: resentment, anger, fury. They are unavailable to me, and you know, because they bring me into a place of unmanageability in my life that really risks what I have. So all of these factors, I think, inform the tone of my work when I have real time to sit and consider things.
That's a really interesting thing you've said there about the isolation required to write the book provides you with the most exposure to your own self. That because I'm in the middle. I think I just finished reading Cal Newport's book Deep Work for the third time because I constantly have to refresh myself on it because. Yeah, I'm very prone to getting distracted and not focusing on the things. And I'm trying to finish a book myself at the minute. And I'm trying to do it by carving out as much time by myself with zero distractions as I can. And that's so you think that the isolation helps you to carve away at the noise and really just like once it's just you and the page.
Yeah, because you go through different stages. I would say for me, 20% of the process is fun. And usually the stuff I write when it's fun, that's the stuff that needs edited the most. Because with the fun and with that feeling of weightlessness, as the words just fall out of you and onto the page effortlessly, a kind of overconfidence and grandiosity can creep in. Anyone who makes the assumption that their thoughts are worthy of writing down and sharing with the world has an ego. And most people have an ego and it manifests in different ways. And so the stuff that seems to come so easily, that's usually the stuff that I have to go back over. And it's an interesting paradox because the stuff that you're grinding out, I mean, that media chapter in the book, that comes in two parts. The Jeremy Kyle part was written 2 years ago and didn't change very much. And it was the only chapter in the book where I resisted any editorial suggestions. I was like, no, everything in there. This is my guitar solo. That was how I described it. But the problem was I had a different part one to that chapter, which was an analysis of class through entertainment. So talking about drama, for example, where the rules of drama is that your characters must face turmoil and this must force them to change, and that this is what makes it interesting to watch. But in the soap opera, which is the distinctly working class form of drama, then the dramatic irony and the tension all comes from knowing that these characters are incapable of changing. And so it's all about watching them trying to change and then reverting back to what they originally were. And I found it all very, very interesting. And I spent like £100 or something on an academic journal that was really like deep diving into this throughout history. But the publisher was very, very strong with me about this needs to be about ownership of media. This needs to be about the bigger picture. And once I conceded to that, it was very difficult for me to change gear and to sit and do that. And I remember spending 2-3 days in a hotel just nearby my house so that I could still come home and be around, and just feeling the stress and the strain of having to change direction, like doing 180 turn right at the very end of the process. But I'm experienced enough now to know that when it's very, very difficult and you just feel like you're only getting a paragraph down every hour, eventually you will break through the wall that you've hit. And when you do, you will produce the thing that everyone around you knows you're capable of producing. And so it's weird because isolation in and of itself is not a pleasant thing, but you need it. You need it to write. And so it's getting the balance, I think, between making sufficient time to be alone with your thoughts and to truly consider what you're doing, and also not allowing yourself to turn your life into a kind of deleted scene from The Shining, which I can admit can occur on occasion in my life. Writing a book in lockdown was not fun.
Yeah, I remember the day finishing my first one. It was just me, and I was just like, I have to sit here until it is done. It's like, I can't remember who it was that said, I think it was Michael Caine. He's like, talent has nothing to do with it. It's about doing it over and over and over and over.
And it's the same with everything. It's the same with if you're making adjustments to your nutrition, if you're trying to get in physical shape, if you're trying to decorate a house, if you're trying to raise a child, there is the kind of image that's out there about what that success looks and feels like, and there's the reality of what achieving anything in life is actually about, which is it all happens incrementally, and you go through a cycle of feeling like it's easy and fun to feeling like it's difficult to impossible, and then questioning, why am I doing this? But as long as you have the discipline to keep making contact and reminding yourself of what the final goal is, then it means that when your will is up and down and dissipates here and there, and your motivation can be all over the place, you have a way of doing things that is not dependent on all of those little peaks and troughs, and rather is more about just being consistent. And that's something that's so important in all aspects of life, I would say.
Yeah, it's also fascinating that you say that the bits that come easiest are the parts that need the most editing. I'm going to have to really reconsider how I think, because I find the bits where I'm in flow, the parts that read the best. It's but maybe that's the ego and the hubris speaking.
Well, this is where editors come in handy. This is where an editor comes in really handy, and that's a part of the process that I enjoyed very much with the second book. I was kind of left to my own devices with the first one because it was a local independent publisher, and I had never written a book before, so I didn't really understand what the process was. And so really the whole structure of that book, how it feels and how it reads, is a product of me being left alone. There were offers of help, but at the time I didn't really understand the necessity of an editor. And that was probably your 1 in a million situation where it worked out very well because of the kind of book I was writing, which was mainly driven through memoir and personal story. But with the second book, once after 2 years into the process, I held my hand up and says, I need help with this. Then, the help came very quickly, and it came in abundance. And everyone at eBay really helped me to get it over the finish line. And some of the suggestions that I received about structure, some of the suggestions that I received about tone, because there were points of the book, I think, where I was maybe toning it down too much, and publisher would remind me, you need to say what you really feel. And if you feel angry about this particular thing, then you should be putting that across. So the editorial process, I think, is where most books really do come to life. And again, it's like anything in life. It's very difficult for us to be objective about ourselves and our own work. And that's why we need fresh eyes on it. And also there's something about the humility that's cultivated where you're not frightened of constructive criticism. And I think that makes you a more well-rounded and mature person in whatever profession you're in or whatever walk of life that you're in. And so I always enjoy something that challenges me as a person as well to grow or mature in some way. And I think that's really that's the personal development aspect that's really happening as you proceed through a big piece of work. Hopefully you would come out of it the other side a slightly different person, as well as having produced something for people to enjoy.
Yeah, perseverance is a skill to be learned, I think. I don't think it's a trait. Anyway, I'd love to talk to you all about writing, but I'd say people probably want to hear about the book itself as well. I'm glad you mentioned Grenfell, because that was one of the things that I wanted to bring up, because that's the point at which I think in the past maybe 10, 15 years where the difference between the experiences of different classes of people in Britain has been most exposed, I think, and the reality. I know, and I saw so many takes about it that were just like, oh well, how did this happen? Like people can. I can't even fathom how the decisions that were made that led to what happened. Like it's a form of like murder by negligence on a scale that's disgusting, and the sort of lack of consequences is also disturbing, like really disturbing. So like,
But when you look at it, then what you see is a lot of the kind of what's regarded as the middle class norms and middle class conventions, or the ruling class conventions. You know, the structure of a corporation, for example, chains of accountability,
yeah,
how disciplinary procedures work. I mean, a politician has to refer themselves to a standards committee if they are suspected of wrongdoing. Another person can be deported within a couple of days' notice for producing the wrong form. So there's disproportionate consequences for perceived wrongdoing, and that really underscored a lot of this initially. But then there's also the structures and mechanisms by which people are protected from consequences. So despite the fact that you've got people who are very conservative, who believe in personal responsibility, I can't really think of one conservative politician or one conservative political leader at any level of governance over the last 10 years who's held their hands up and said, I fucked up, in any instance, whether it be a lot of the germinal events that led to the Grenfell fire, whether it be even stuff going on in the very top flight of politics. They always have a way of worming their way out of things. They always have a way of doing that. And it's not just because they're very skilled manipulators, it's because there's a whole infrastructure that exists of consultants and advisors and little mechanisms that mean that corporate personalities accept responsibility for things and individual people don't. And this is really what helps to place the truth of Grenfell in obscurity until it's really dug into through a lot of public anger, which then obviously means that the books have all got to get opened and looked at. And the thing about Grenfell as well is this idea was a freak event. There were fires in London of a similar nature prior to that in the preceding years, and as well as the warnings of the Grenfell Action Group, which were just disturbingly prescient. And so it was just something about that situation, I think, that really did help to remind people of what's at stake when your society is not only falling into kind of some sort of moral disrepair, but also when the consequences of being complicit in that can be eluded, because we've got over 70 people who lost their lives. There's still people who are probably still homeless or residentially unstable as a result of that. The trauma in that community is going to be multi-generational, and yet still no one's been held accountable for it.
Yeah,
it's mind-boggling.
I don't even think the council got a fine or anything. It's and it really is.
The insurance company knew more about the dangers of the cladding than the council did. So if you go in, and there was a lot more detail in the chapter, and some of it had to be taken out because it was just, you've got to kind of take into consideration how readable it is. But there was a lot of stuff that I produced in the chapter, which I think I maybe just allude to now in a line or two, which is that insurance companies, had assessed the whole thing. And so they understood the risks about fire safety in terms of the gentrification of that building better than the local authority that was running it from a distance. And that tells you everything that you need to know, really. The people running that council, they didn't really give a shit. And then suddenly, once they're taking out the corpses, then everyone's very sad and upset. But the truth is, that's the sort of thing heads need to roll to send a unequivocal signal to people in that social class. If you take a position of high responsibility that's well paid and you have power and connections and you fuck up on this kind of scale, then you can end up in the slammer as well as the person who was on the front page of a paper a few days after the fire, who was found to be robbing a dead body or something. You know what I mean? Like, you're just as bad, so in you go. Have a few months in jail or a few years, hopefully.
Yeah, and that sort of that feeling that like heads should roll for something is, and this this lack of consequences that we kind of touched on a few times for people of a certain social class or a certain position of power is really the issue. It's the reason for a lot of the anger, I would say, and probably also like not just in a sense of people's like mistrust or anger towards institutions. I think it's very much at the root of the collapse of a lot of our institutions, that they've become like horrible, disfigured imitations of the thing that they were designed to do, or the laws they were designed to uphold, or whatever function it might be, whether we're talking about the NHS or social services, any policing, exactly, like any of these things. Why do you when do you think it was that we stopped demanding those sorts of consequences?
Well, when I think a kind of apathy sets in when you see disproportionate consequences between social classes. You start thinking this is just the way it is. What's the point in challenging it? And so I think what politicians have started to do quite skillfully is to be distracting us with culture war stuff and stuff that I wouldn't say is not important. I don't take the position that anyone out there who has an issue about illegal immigration is acting on complete falsehoods or is driven by xenophobia and bigotry. I think most people begin from a place where their concerns could be characterised as understandable or legitimate based on the information that they have. But what politicians help to do is to actually take people who are in a place where they can be reasoned with and bring them further along a kind of conveyor belt towards less and less rational positions on things. They begin to draw connections between different things. And so if you turn on GB News with the fallout from this whole Philip Schofield episode, you'll see them trying to braid together different elements, with ITV apparently being a woke broadcaster. This is the same broadcaster that ran Jeremy Kyle's show Into the Ground and kept on broadcasting it until someone literally died. This is the broadcaster that has no editorial slant, no house style, never originates anything, is literally just a bunch of commercial incentives producing things in a zombie-like state, armed to the teeth with public relations experts, right? There's nothing woke about ITV. But GB News sees an opportunity here to move into a new position in our culture through this Philip Schofield story by not just talking about the ins and outs of that, but then bringing in wokeness, right? The ITV's woke, then bringing in something about, Prince William or his wife. And so what they do is they create this impression that all of that is interconnected. And for a politician, that means that the terrain is much easier to navigate, because all they have to do is point to the go-to folk devil of the day whenever any serious issue is being discussed. Mm-hmm. And because people are so stressed out, because people are so emotionally vulnerable, and because we have all this build-up of prior resentments about prior unrelated issues, it's like a couple getting into an argument almost where they start casting up things that happened 2 years ago, 5 years ago. They start talking in hyperbole. You always do this, or you always do that. And once you're in that terrain, it's all irrational discussion. And politicians, they can whip people up into a frenzy through that, and that makes everyone a lot easier to manage. So I think that that's really how they've managed to paper over the cracks of class inequality, because they do that divide and conquer technique. And then obviously parties more to the left of that, Starmer's Labour project, you can see how they truly feel they have no option but to just out-Tory the Tories.
Yeah.
Because they recognise if they were to speak sensibly about things, that's not going to get the front page. And that was the case particularly when they went after Sunak around him apparently, being lenient on child abusers. a dirty, nasty type of campaign. But the reason they stuck by it was because all the advice that they were getting was, no one's going to know what your policy is unless you take this tone and this strategy. And that's why they never apologised for it. And unfortunately, that just moves the Overton window more and more to the non-rational type of discourse that we see.
Yeah, yeah, and it's very easy as well for like a little bit on the other side of that sort of issue where people, especially working class people with like legitimate concerns about, say, like high levels of immigration pushing down wages, and maybe the lack of housing available being exacerbated by that. Like obviously there's other factors involved in these things. Do you know what I mean? It's about training, the skills we're giving to the workforce, the amount of housing we're building. But like those concerns are legitimate, I think, in some senses. And then instead of addressing that and going, yeah, okay, so government needs to build more housing, and the reason that there's such high levels of immigration is because we are not training the people that the country needs, especially for things like the NHS. And those discussions about how we might address these issues are just derailed by whipping the other side up into being like, oh, look at all these xenophobic, racist, right wing bigots. That it's a very easy way to distract from the underlying like real things.
Yeah, and to be honest, there is a kind of symmetry at play, because I mean, for 40 years I've been brought up in a left-wing culture where whatever Tory Prime Minister's been in charge has been the worst person ever. And now I think to myself, I don't know if I could stand up here and seriously argue that David Cameron is worse than Boris Johnson, or seriously argue that George W. Bush is worse than Donald Trump. So when the quality of politics and politicians declines year upon year, it recontextualizes figures from the past. But you start to think, you know what? At least they believed in something. At least they had an argument. At least they got out there and fought for their position. Whereas now it seems to be people are adopting policy positions based on what's trending. And this is kind of done on the hoof almost.
Yeah.
And it's all about gaining some kind of short-term electoral or media advantage. And this means that the sort of person who excels in that kind of environment is the sort of person who has no convictions about anything, who sees power as power for its own sake. And unfortunately, when that sort of character is situating themselves around power all the time, then you can't expect anything else than the country to be feeling like it's in a constant state of upheaval and crisis. I mean, if you take a politician like Tony Blair, for example, who I feel I was quite generous about in the book, despite the fact that I didn't pull any punches with respect to what his legacy is. But on the left, because of Blair's position on Iraq, which I disagree with and I think was the wrong position, and I think deep down all of them know it was the wrong position, but they've gone on too long now to hold their hands up and apologise for it. And fair enough, they've got to put their head in the pillow at night and live with it, right? But this idea that he wasn't a skilled communicator, this idea that he wasn't, there was no reason why he should have been elected in the first place. If you go back and listen to Tony Blair debate, if you go back and listen to Tony Blair reasoning through a point of view with a very, very critical journalist or whatever, you can see why people thought, this guy is competent. He's a competent kind of human being. He's the sort of person you can trust with power. And whatever you think of his character now after the passage of time, then I feel like on the left we should be able to acknowledge basic facts about someone, even if they did make decisions that we think were the wrong decisions. But on the left, you have a kind of a flip side of what you see on the right, which is a person says or does something disagreeable, and this means that everything they say or do going forward must be discounted or seen through the lens of that other terrible thing that they did. Obviously, there are instances where that is relevant, if someone shows such low character, they're not worth listening to. But my view with Blair, for example, having studied the whole New Labour project for many years, looked at all of the various inquiries into the Iraq War, then what you see is a politician who's really just been kind of hoodwinked by the Americans who play them at every single stage because they needed a human shield to buy them some time to do what they were always going to do. And Blair's big flaw as a person is that reverence he has for power, and it doesn't come any more powerful than getting flown over to the White House, where really, he was just kind of, he was used, really. I don't think he's evil. I don't think he wanted to kill Iraqis. I don't think there was some darker ploy underneath it. And while obviously a lot of that stuff still did happen, and that has to be, people have to be held to account for that. Also, at the same time, characterising it as something more than what it is a similar form of non-rationality, I would argue. And even me just saying this right now will trigger people, but that's not the intent. You know what I mean? It's just like when I sat and thought about it for a long time, I thought, on the left, we're guilty sometimes of that non-rational way of thinking and conducting ourselves. It's just that we don't see it like that because we believe in what we believe in. Yeah, it's like purity tests almost. And you think you're right. We're very fast to throw the baby out with the bathwater on a lot of people who care. Like I think honestly, I think this is something I talk about this a lot. But one of the things that I think, the more people I interview for this podcast, and the more people I speak to in life generally, the more I realize that there's so few people out there who are actually bad actors, who are genuinely bad people trying to make life horrible and awful for some other people in the world. But almost everyone is arriving at the positions or policy ideas or opinions that they hold because they want a better world. And it's not because they, there's even we talked about the working class people being painted as right wing xenophobes, the ones who are living in the husks of former industrial powerhouses, and they've watched their city decline for 40 years, and they've watched as opportunity has disappeared, as wages have been driven down, and they legitimately voice an opinion based on things used to be better. Just even something as simple as that, things used to be better, and then immediately, before anyone considers, that maybe they don't mean because everyone was white. They mean because one income could support a family, that there was opportunity, there was, prosperity, a bit of positivity in the streets. There was a flourishing high street, they were making stuff in this town, it was a thriving place, and that people get painted as you just want to take us back to this time when, straight white men ruled, and the mischaracterization of people's actual intentions, I think, is a real problem. Yeah. Well, if you look, Corbyn was not exactly an let's open all the borders type of politician.
No.
He took a position on immigration. He took a position on that, and it was a position that, so the fact that any politician who wants to get into power has to have a policy about immigration shows you that there is an issue about immigration in Britain that needs to be dealt with. And the question then is, how is that debate characterised? Is it characterised as kind of almost racist? Suella Braverman, paedophiles, they're coming in, they're coming from all over the place, they're gangsters, they're doing this, blah, 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 blah. Because that's like catnip. It might get you somewhere in a short term, but also it curdles the discussion and really kind of it makes your point automatically illegitimate, any legitimate point you might have. So it's weird that a politician might take a position on immigration which is broadly similar, but depending on what side of the fence they're on, then that'll either be seen as the best thing ever or the worst thing ever. I think most politicians are quite moderate when it comes to immigration, whether on the left or right. They speak in the same sort of tones about it. Where you see conservative politicians being kind of, I think, tending towards far right rhetoric is when that's just out of pure political desperation, because the media has such a grip over the quality of discourse. But when Cameron was beginning to kind of fall into those tropes, I didn't for a second think he actually believed it. I thought he thought this is a short-term strategy to get to a place that we need to get to. But every time Suella Braverman opens her mouth, I truly believe that she is that type of character. And what's also interesting is, for years we've been getting told by some people on the left that only white people are capable of racism, and now those people are stuck for a word to describe Suella Braverman.
I hadn't even thought about it like that. That's fucking hilarious. Oh, that's brilliant. I hadn't even thought of it like that. So I have you got time? There's just one last thing I wanted to sort of ask you about.
Yeah, fire away.
Yeah. So we talked sort of really, really briefly, and we sort of mentioned about your book sort of touches on the different experiences of the pandemic that different people had. And you talked about, in a different context, the sort of moral disrepair of British society. Like I think it'd be very hard. You'd be hard placed to find someone who wouldn't agree that is what has been happening to Britain over the past, handful of decades. I'm not sure there's many people who would disagree with you on that point, but something that really it really sat weird with me through the entire pandemic, and I'm hoping maybe you'll be able to shed some light on your thoughts on this, is that empathy for people's positions when it wasn't your own, like say that had determined that they were going to make different decisions to you or had different opinions to you, was so offensive and like anger inducing to some people through the whole thing. It really weirded me out that we'd sort of seem to have lost perspective that other people might be in different situations to us. Say a working class person's objection to having lockdowns mean schools were closed. If you're a single parent with 4 kids and 1 laptop, you to say I think kids should be in school, all of a sudden you're a granny killer when your own person, the horrible things that people had to go through through those 2 years, like fear, isolation, people unable to see dying relatives, people unable to continue with their lives in the way they had. The humor and suffering that we showed zero empathy for through those 2 years is, I've never quite got over it. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why we were so unable to be empathetic for other people's positions through that time.
Well, it goes back to the original point from the first question, first of all, but then also the additional emotional, psychological strain of the pandemic means that we're under a level of chronic stress where we can't access those other emotions because we're in a sort of minor fight or flight. We're constantly being bombarded with hot takes, negativity. We don't really know what's true or right because there's so much information out there. So the positions that we're arriving at, whether we like to tell ourselves that we understand the evidence, the positions are emotionally based or faith-based. We're placing our faith in an expert of a particular stripe who's saying a particular thing, and we're saying, that's the evidence that I believe. And no matter what position you took or what situation you were in, I think we were both transmitters of that lack of empathy at points, and we were repositories of that lack of empathy at points. I remember when I was on Facebook and we were talking about it was vaccines or something, and I was just making a joke about what I imagined in my head to be like your kind of Alex Jones tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist, or I was I would post a picture of myself after getting a vaccine or something like that. I didn't really talk about COVID much in terms of expressing big, strong opinions about things like lockdowns. I sympathised with the politicians the first time round. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a country in the world that didn't lock down, so there was nothing distinctly authoritarian about Britain. doing it, to be honest. Plus, I didn't subscribe to the view that there was some big economic ploy to disempower people financially, because actually most companies took a hit, most business took a hit as a result of lockdown as well. Apart from obviously the big tech companies that just raced away.
Yeah, well,
but I remember
they're seeing layoffs now anyway. Like they're all
yeah. So I remember, but I remember the pushback I would get for what I would consider just to even be relatively minor quips or updates about things, and then suddenly what I realised was I had this idea in my head of who the people were that I would be making fun of, and I didn't realise that actually ran right through my social group now. That run right through my family. That runs right through my my groups of friends, my recovery community. All of that divergence of opinion, suddenly it was very tangible and it was very close to home, because things like Brexit, things like COVID, all of these things, they transcend the other previous political divides. You can't predict a person's position on one thing based on their position on another when it comes to these issues. And so it creates all these weird folds that put strain on your family dynamics, that put strain on your relationships. And it took a while for me to learn, actually, there's some things maybe I shouldn't say on Facebook if I value friendships and I value kind of mutual respect. And so it was, I would say there was some friendships maybe that suffered perhaps beyond repair during that period. And I think maybe there are a lot of other people out there who are the same. Social media, in the long run, once we manage to get some of the genie back in the bottle, which we'll have to, is just a really profound, disruptive, radical thing to happen to a society. And it's taken us a long time as individuals, as communities, and as societies to start to understand what this really is, that we live in echo chambers, that we've got an algorithm that's showing us things that thinks that we'll like rather than things that are important. And how do you decide how to regulate that? Is it authoritarian to start telling a company what it should show people? Who knows? So much to discuss. And we've not even got our heads around that now. We're dealing with artificial intelligence. So I think hopefully the lessons that we didn't learn from social media and the kind of laissez-faire approach we took to social media in the beginning, hopefully that will serve as a good incentive to get right around the issue of artificial intelligence before it races away from us and just creates additional problems for us.
Yeah. I mean, I hope so. Like social media, I think we're still figuring out what social media is to human society, or what it should be, even. And it's interesting to watch the old world burn in like Facebook and Instagram. Like it's hilarious because I was looking at a friend of mine recently like read my first book, and they were talking I went back and they were asking me questions about it, and I was talking a lot about Facebook. Because in 2016, for the Brexit vote, Facebook was the place where everything was happening, basically, right? It was all the dark ads, all the absolute rubbish from Leave.eu, like the Turkey things, you know. There was a lot of like shady stuff going on. And Facebook is irrelevant now. It's just irrelevant. Like it's dropped off the face of the earth in terms of like its relevance to like everyday society, which is wild in that length of time. So it'd be interesting to see. The last very fast thing I want to ask was, you said there, do you think that like chronic stress had a lot to do with the lack of empathy? Do you think that is just something that a lot of people are dealing with just all the time now in modern Britain, that there's like a portion of society who are just permanently in that chronic stress phase?
Yeah. I mean, this is really what Poverty Safari kind of ends up being about, to a certain extent, from the commentary point of view, as what is the driver at the level of the individual, of the lifestyle and the habits that we get into that create poor health outcomes, and how that's created by the environment around us. And this, I think, all of that stuff is then compounded with the additional stimulus of social media. The average person has a very kind of finite amount of issues that they can cope with. And unfortunately, most people aren't really taught the tools that you can implement when you're facing stress. And you don't want to talk to someone about reducing their stress either when they're stressed. So what tends to happen now is that we just become reactive. People get stressed, they react to it by becoming stressed. Then politicians or other people they disagree with react to that stress. And then it just becomes a kind of reciprocation of various positions based on a stress-based outlook. And I think that this does inform the kind of discourse generally, because when we're stressed, we aren't really able to actively listen. We're very selective in terms of what we can actually pick up, what's going on. When we're stressed, we're not very geared up for empathy when we're stressed. And all of these things, to be honest, make proper discussion and understanding virtually impossible. And so it has a very corrosive effect, because it becomes a kind of race to the bottom in terms of communication. And ultimately, when you have issues at play as complicated as they can be in the UK just now, communication is very important, for setting a tone, for conveying information. And unfortunately, I think media can feed into this as well. I don't have an answer or a solution for it, unfortunately, because it's kind of its own thing. It needs to kind of peter out. I think one way of reducing the stress levels would be for politicians to get a proper grip on what's going on just now in terms of living costs. I mean, there's just every other day someone tossing themselves off a pier, hanging themselves from a tree. Fucking, it's a nightmare for a lot of folk who are out there just now. The stress just becomes overwhelming for them. So I don't really have an answer yet. I can only look at my own stress levels as an individual and how I deal with them, and hopefully maybe in some small way contribute by modelling a way of being that's about more mindfulness in the face of stress and being part of a community and all the things that increase well-being,
Yeah. I want to actually, I don't normally do this, but I want to finish by reading a little bit from your book. Because I sent a picture of it to someone, and was just, they were blown away that someone could write this, basically. And now I'm not going to be able to find the exact bit that I want. Here we are. I'm not sure exactly why this reminded me of it, but you're going to go for this. So post-industrialization is often framed in employment terms. Traditional industries were wound down, creating mass unemployment and economic displacement, which contributed to social problems like crime and drug addiction. High-rise housing became synonymous with dereliction. Many developments were pitched to poor areas of progress, but instead unlocked the back door for the unwieldy forces of gentrification. In the analysis of the effects of deindustrialization, too little is made of the abrupt disruption and thoughtless dispersal of individuals and families who had once lived side by side. Many of these communities were ripped up by their cornerstones with little understanding of the possible long-term social consequences. The key aspect conspicuously absent from the mainstream post-industrial mythos, illustrated so often by the iconography of demolitions and mine and shipyard closures, is perhaps the most pivotal. The needlessly violent severing of vital social connections forged over decades that once bound individuals, families and communities in tight-knit, resilient groups. Connections laid down over generations that granted a sense of belonging and shared history in which people could orient themselves and guide others. I think that speaks more than anything else as to how we probably get ourselves out of this, and it's community and social connection.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you listen to people talking about the good old days, whether they were materially poorer, whether there were objectively less opportunities, what they're looking back at through rose-tinted glasses is a time where you could leave your kids with your neighbour, a time where you knew all of the local shopkeepers, they knew what you took in your tea, they knew how hot you like your rolls, they knew your first name, you would pick up a conversation where it left off the previous time that you had seen them, and all of those little interactions accumulate impact as a sense of, this is my place. I belong here. These people know me, I know them. And that brings into play all sorts of informal social controls and conventions that help that community to manage itself to some extent. There's less need for police, there's less need for health intervention. But now we're in a situation where it used to take a village to raise a kid, and now, a single mother's got to do it on her own with 3 children because, her husband died in a car crash or died from alcoholism or died or is in prison or something like that. We haven't really acknowledged that the way that we operate in families and communities now is fundamentally different to any other time in our social history. And I'm not just talking about Britain, I'm talking about human beings. Mm-hmm. The way that we live now is we're not evolutionarily designed for this kind of living. And at some point, once we've put out all the fires, if we can, we need to start thinking about how do we get back to designing a society that gets the most out of people, that's about making sure that our basic needs are met socially.
Yeah. Anyway, Darren, I've taken up enough of your time. It has been an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Everybody, becomes more recommended than anything. Go check out Darren's book, The Social Distance Between Us. Thanks very much, man. Is there anything you want to plug?
No, I'm good. I mean, I'm playing. I've got 2 gigs down Devon in July at Yaleford and Plymouth. This is, I think, the 7th and 8th of July. So anyone watching who's down that neck of the woods who fancies coming along, please do. I think there are limited tickets available for both. But apart from that, the next thing I'll be doing will be a series on BBC Two. So this will be the first thing I've done on network television. And hopefully that'll be out either by the end of the year or the start of next. So look out for it.
Oh, that's exciting. I'll look out for that. Hey, everyone. Thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.